Hello class, this is the next video in the series of videos on the English 110 research project. This video will look at part 2 of the research project that is called the evidence clusters section. If you want to watch part 1, please watch that video about the summaries. This one will focus on part 2. So, the evidence cluster section of the research project, part 2, is when Coates' essay, The Case for Reparation, returns to the project. This section, part 2, will focus primarily on your analysis of Coates' essay and how it connects to the research that you've done. In this section, you will use quotes and not summary. You always use quotes when you're going to provide analysis of what has been written. So in this section, we will look at how to introduce, quote, and analyze evidence properly in a structured format. Overall, in the evidence clusters, you will choose 2 pieces of evidence from Coates' essay. All right? 2 pieces of evidence, 2 key ideas from Coates' essay that you feel are important and relate to things discussed in the research. Right? Once you have selected these 2 pieces of Coates' essay, right, you will use one quote that describes this evidence that you will then explain why this quote is important and how it connects to something stated in the research. All right? So you will find 2 pieces of evidence. These evidence will then be quoted, which you will then analyze and connect to the research that you have found. The evidence cluster is where you will create what we call PI paragraphs. PI is a acronym that is used to allow students to understand that all paragraphs that use quotes for this project and other papers that you will write for college should have a point, illustration, and explanation. So just as we analyzed how the summary paragraphs have a certain structure that you should follow, your evidence clusters should have a PI structure. They should have a point, illustration, and explanation. All right? And you will be using evidence from the case for reparations to build your PI paragraph. So let's start with the very beginning, the P part of the PI paragraph structure. This is called the point. Every paragraph that you write should usually have a point, a main idea, a topic sentence. Now, you should only ever have 1 point per paragraph. One of the common mistakes beginning writers use is they will take multiple points, multiple ideas, and smoosh them together. Right? You don't want to do that. Right? So 1 point per paragraph. This point must clearly express a position or idea in the paragraph. This should come in the top half of the paragraph and should clearly connect to the goal of the essay. Okay? So, in this particular paper, your point should state an important idea from Coates' essay. Let's look at an example of a point that could be used in the research project. In the interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, Coates discusses how redlining is a legacy of slavery. This topic shares an idea from the case for reparations that the long history of slavery impacts the lives of African Americans today. The point of this paragraph that is being built, an example, is the idea that in the interview, the idea of redlining is a part of the long history of slavery that impacts the lives of current African Americans. This is the point of the paragraph. Everything that comes after that will be connected to this point. It will be explaining or clarifying this point from Coates' essay, right? And how it connects to the research. After you have a point, right, the next thing that you should have is illustration. Illustration, in a general perspective, refers to the type of evidence you use to prove your points. Types of illustration that you may commonly use in the future could be expert testimony, examples, statistics, interviews. Right? For this paper, for this specific project, your illustration will be a quote from Coates' essay. That is the major illustration you have to use in the evidence cluster section of the paper. Right? So moving forward, your illustration will be all other types of evidence. For this particular paper, you should use a quote from Coates' essay, an idea that you have found in Coates' essay. Now, as you write your illustration, as you write the quote from Coates' essay, it's important to remember that quotes, when used as evidence, can never be their own complete sentence. So, what we mean by that is that you always have to introduce the quote that you're using. You should never have quote mark, sentence, quote mark, citation. That is not a proper and clear way to introduce the evidence you are using. So, what we want you to use is to use an introductory phrase that sets up the illustration, sets up the quote you are going to use. Now, this can be as basic as according to, comma, quote. Right? Or it can be something like in Smith's view, quote. These two here are the basic baseline ways, at the very least, to introduce a quotation. Another way to introduce a quotation is to use a descriptive verb and a comma. Oftentimes you want to avoid using the word says or said, as those are words that are often said during an interview and are not very descriptive. So you could use something like Smith asserts, Smith remarks, Smith comments, Smith explains. So just remember, as you are presenting the evidence from Coates' essay, right, you need to introduce that Coates wrote it. You know, at the very least, the very baseline is according to Coates, comma, then you provide the evidence. But try using a descriptive verb. You know, Coates discusses racism. Coates discusses things of that nature. But you must always introduce your evidence. So here's an example of how a student could introduce their evidence. In Coates' essay, he argues that redlining destroyed the possibility of investment wherever Black people lived. Parentheses, page 23. Remember, all quotes, like all pieces of summary, require the MLA in-text citation. Whenever you have a sentence that has an idea that isn't yours, you must use the in-text citation after the end of that sentence. Right? But see how here this writer introduces the quote and then provides the actual evidence. You must always introduce your illustration. So, after having a point for the paragraph, introducing the evidence you are going to use that proves and explains that point, the next step is to explain the evidence you presented. No quotes can stand on their own as evidence. So, for example, as a general rule, your paragraph should never end in a quote. Your paragraph should always end with your explanation. You will often hear this called the quotation sandwich. This means that you have introduced a quote, accurately provided a quote with the citation, and then explained the quote. For our step, our explanation, you should always have two steps. First step, explain what is important about the quote you gave, including any key phrases or ideas. Step two, explain how this quote relates to the point of the paragraph. So first step, what is important about the quote itself? Second, how does this relate to the point of the paragraph? After every quote, you should be able to find yourself doing both steps. What is important? How does it connect to my point? And these should, at the very least, be separate sentences. So, after every quote you give me, you will always need at least 2 sentences of explanation. Oftentimes you will need more, but at the very minimum, you will always need 2 sentences of explanation. So, to reiterate, for this research project, your explanation, after providing me a quote from Coates' essay, should explain why your evidence is important and how this is connected to something in your research. Right? Those are your 2 steps for this research project after every quote. So, here's an example of a complete evidence cluster. So if you're wondering in your head what the evidence clusters, what the paragraphs of part 2 of your research project should look like, here is an example. In Interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, Coates discusses how redlining is a legacy of slavery. This topic shares an idea from the case for reparations from that long history of slavery impacts the lives of African Americans today. In Coates' essay, he argues that redlining destroyed the possibility of investment wherever Black people lived. For both the interview and his essay, redlining is an essential issue for Coates because he wants to stress how the impact of slavery stretches into modern-day issues of racism. Redlining is a part of the history of slavery because, much like slavery, it destroyed the possibility for African Americans to invest in themselves and their community. In the interview, Smith agrees with Coates that redlining is a legacy of slavery and racism. Smith expands on Coates' ideas about housing by using New York as another example of racist redlining principles. So, to reiterate, each evidence cluster, and you will write 2, right? If you think of the evidence clusters as paragraphs, part 2 of the research paper requires 2 paragraphs. Each evidence cluster should have a point, illustration, and explanation. The point should explain a key idea from the case for reparations. The illustration should accurately quote that idea from the case for reparations. The explanation should explain what is important about the quote, specifically any key phrases, ideas, or claims, and explain how this quote relates to one part of the research you did in part 1. So, the evidence clusters should have point, illustration, explanation for both clusters, for both paragraphs. If we look back at our example, all right, this black section here is an example of presenting the point, all right? The point being that redlining is a way that we can see the history of slavery impact African Americans today, all right? Then the writer quotes an idea from Coates' essay, accurately providing an in-text citation. Then for step 1, so if this is P, this part here with the quote is I, then the blue and the red represent the E section, the explanation section of the evidence cluster. Note how here in the red, the writer provides an explanation of what redlining is, explains what is important about the idea expressed in this quote. That is step 1. What is important about the idea of the quote, of the evidence you provided? So your first step after your quote is to tell me what is important, especially explaining any key phrases, ideas, or statements made in that quote. The next step relates it back to the point, right? How the idea of redlining is connected to the interview that was used as a piece of evidence in part 1 of this student's paper. So if you're looking at an appropriate evidence cluster example, this is a very good one, and you will do this twice in part 2 of the research paper. We will complete our discussion on the research paper by looking at part 3 and the work cited in an upcoming video.